Hi everyone. In this video, I'd like to briefly talk with you about asset versus deficit model instruction as we talk about ways of being culturally responsive and ways upon drawing on the background needs and interests of your students. And as we talk about building self-efficacy of your students, I think it's very, very important to differentiate between instruction that is asset-based, meaning that you draw upon the strengths, the interests, and the background knowledge of your students in a positive way that informs your curriculum, or whether your instruction is a deficit model, whether you are operating from certain negative assumptions. And you fail to adequately take into account the background knowledge and needs and interests of your students. Oftentimes, teachers as well as entire districts and um, states, for that matter, will operate under a deficit model instruction. I say states because this is an issue nationwide, not just in one district or one state. Will operate under a deficit model of instruction without adequately identifying it and without adequately reflecting about it. So this is one reason why self-reflection and inquiry is so important to differentiate. Are we asset-based or are we deficit-based? The deficit model of instruction, you put the focus on what the students cannot do, but you fail to adequately look at the cultural context, the systematic context of, for instance, what's going on in the child's life, the opportunity gaps, for instance, that the student might face. For instance, let's take trauma-based instruction. We have looked upon that earlier in this course. A deficit model of trauma instruction focuses on what's wrong with the child. That child is misbehaving, for instance, or that child is showing certain negative aspects of academic behaviors. And we focus on what the child is not doing or cannot do. For instance, acting out in class. In an asset-based approach to trauma-informed instruction, we look at what the student can do, the strengths, but we're not blind to the fact that certain things have happened in that student's life, systemically, structurally, be it trauma with the family or trauma with the community. So countering a deficit model instruction is not about denial. I hear some people, when I try to argue in favor of asset-based instruction instead of deficit-based instruction, the defense of deficit models will often be as if I'm trying to operate in a state of denial, and as if I'm denying that, for instance, children who live in high poverty environments might face risk factors associated with hunger or lack of access to dependable medical care, um, or lack of access to the type of health care that comes from having good insurance, or noise or crime or fear factors. All of these emotional things can add up to what we might call risk factors. But let's be very careful about differentiating between identifying structural aspects and just racing to negative assumptions about a student. And let's be very careful about failing to identify needs and interests and strengths that a student might possess. And let's be very careful about stereotyping students. So for instance, in a deficit model, you tend to not adequately account for the abilities and the strengths and the interests and the passions of the students, and you might completely overlook them, as well as families and communities. Because after all, if you're operating under a negative stereotype or a negative assumption, why would you even look for the strengths and the interests, right? So instead, what I would like you to think about are asset-based approaches to instruction. For instance, when we were looking at the funds of knowledge approach with Louis Moll, where you look for instance, a background base of funds of knowledge that the student, as well as family and community, might have that you can draw upon and learn from to inform your own curriculum. That's an asset-based approach to instruction. So teachers who value asset-based approaches to instruction, they'll get to truly know their students. They'll see the real value of getting to know their students. They'll also get to know students' families, and they'll get to know the local community, and they'll draw upon, for instance, community leaders. They'll get to know community leaders in a very real way, and draw upon that to strengthen their curriculum. So you put the focus on what strengths do these students possess, as well as community and family. What background knowledge is possessed, and how can I connect that outside background knowledge to new academic learning? And what interests and passions do the students have, and how can I connect that to academic learning that's taking place in my science class or social studies or math or whatever it is? And you draw upon that as a strength instead of just simply assuming that the student or a family or community is one big deficit, right? So again, you very carefully identify key areas of strength that you can build upon in your academic curriculum. This includes outside, this includes relationships. Um, think back to the ecological systems approach of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, for instance, and how that will inform us that there's this interlinking, interwoven system of family and community that interacts over time in the chrono system. And this is continuously shaping and reshaping a sense of identity. And an asset-based instruction takes this systems approach and draws upon that to inform the curriculum in a very real way. So again, you are identifying, and your goal is always, of course, learning gains, but you're using what's outside, the background knowledge, to help you plan and help you develop plans and even interventions that can help your students make learning gains. And oftentimes you would talk about this together with your professional learning community, for instance, or your fellow teachers, or your cohort of science or math teachers, so that how can I plan my instruction? How can I build instructional strategies that build upon interests of my students or the background knowledge of my students and connect this to strengthen their academic learning? And very importantly, you want to identify negative stereotypes that might be out there. Um, it's possible that your fellow teachers might hold negative stereotypes. It's very possible that you yourself might hold negative stereotypes without necessarily um, reflecting on them yet. Um, that happens with all of us, right? Oftentimes we're so afraid of this self-analysis, self-reflection, but we've got to do a deep self-reflection about negative stereotypes that we ourselves might hold um, in order to counter them. Because I would argue you can try to do all these instructional strategies that you've learned about in my class and others all you want. And you can say all you want about how you value and respect the background of students and culture of the background of students. And you might even mean it. And I'm sure you're being honest. But if you're walking around with a bunch of negative stereotypes and deficit model instruction, then no matter how honestly you may mean to draw upon the student's strengths and how honestly you may mean to build upon student self-efficacy, and no matter how much you may genuinely love your students in the agape love sense, you may genuinely have an agape love for your students, but if you're walking around with negative stereotypes and a deficit model approach, Houston, we've got a problem. So we've got to counter false stereotypes that are out there. Oftentimes, these stereotypes might have to do with assuming that students and families and communities aren't really planning for the future, or might lack a work ethic, or have low intellectual abilities. And oftentimes, this is countered with some scientific basis that gets interpreted in false ways. For instance, again, we talk about children who grow up in extreme high poverty circumstances. There are genuine risk factors involved. For instance, hunger or lack of access to medical care in early childhood can potentially negatively impact neurological development. But the trouble is that under a deficit model, we take that recognition of risk factors, and these risk factors point structurally to the need to address these risk factors with better healthcare, with better access um, to care and food. And for instance, the Head Start program was started to try to address these risk factors. Um, so the idea isn't to be in a state of denial, but the idea is to recognize structural inequities, address structural inequities, but without resorting to stereotypes and without resorting to negative assumptions that negatively impact the quality of instruction that you give to students. Because if you're operating based upon these stereotypes, then it will negatively impact the type of instruction that you give. And your instruction to students, for instance, living in poverty, might be a lot less engaging because of these negative assumptions. And these negative assumptions, that, by the way, have been countless times debunked in research literature. For instance, there's this myth, and I'm calling it a myth for a reason, of a culture of poverty. In the 1960s, the phrase culture of poverty was coined by an ethnographer named Oscar Lewis. Oscar Lewis had actually been respected in his day, but he started churning out some very low quality ethnographic research. And he did some very poor quality ethnographic research in which he studied certain small sampling of local communities, and he made broad, sweeping, unjustified generalizations about what it means to live in poverty. And some of these negative stereotypes that he promoted was strong present time orientation. What this means is that he promoted the idea that people who live in poverty have a certain culture of poverty where they're not really thinking about the future. And high tolerance for psychological pathology. What Lewis meant by that is that people who live in poverty have a high tolerance for crime. Now the trouble is that with all of us, I can think of negative encounters I've had with people who are from various economic strata, upper income, middle class, lower income, and the idea sociologically that we can have that neat divide between those three classes. That's not the way that it works. But to take those negative experiences that may have been had with a person from economic class, or someone who's wealthy, or someone who might live in poverty, and then go into this broad sweeping stereotype is very bad. And now all of a sudden we've got a scholar with a doctorate and other scholars who start promoting this idea, and now all of a sudden you've got this idea of a culture of poverty that starts getting promoted under the guise of scholarship, when in fact the scholarship was very poor and it has been debunked. So, for example, the original research by Lewis that's the basis for this idea of a culture of poverty was using bias and sampling, poor sampling methods, as well as small sampling methods. He was using a term called a culture trait uh, to, to in research, we like to identify certain themes that arise, and we code our research based upon themes, and we look for patterns. And he did not use the commonly accepted definition for culture trait. He used a different way in which he was defining culture trait, but he never actually clearly defined it. And so he's talking about traits that arose, but he doesn't even define how he's looking at this. It was very flawed research. Um, the standard in which he was measuring and identifying and theme and coding his research was never clearly identified. He talked about generational patterns of behavior that constitutes the so-called culture of poverty based upon interviews that he did. And he did interview uh, grandparents and parents, and so in single studies, so he tried to use that to talk about intergenerational, but he did not do any follow-up longitudinal studies. And so again, this idea of longitudinal claims that he made was not backed up by research, and his sampling methods were skewed. Like I said, and not to mention small sampling methods. And so it was extremely, extremely flawed research that, unfortunately, the language of a culture of poverty has survived over the years, and it survives to this day. And you may have heard of the term culture of poverty, and I'm sure that as we're about to see, it has the concept of a culture of poverty has found its way into professional development sessions that are given in all 50 states when we talk about how do you teach students who live in poverty. And it's a very flawed thing that has been repeatedly debunked in the research literature. So again, the culture of poverty promotes the idea of a culture of poverty, which has been debunked, promotes the assumption that low-income students achieve poorly in school because their families fail to provide the type of socialization and moral foundation that will equip, and motivation that will equip the students for academic success. And so what's the solution then? It's this almost savior type mentality of we need to of middle class teachers, because let's face it, the majority of teachers demographically are white middle class. That white middle class teachers need to save um, children who live in poverty by replacing the values of their home and family with middle class value systems and middle class work ethic. And you can see the negative stereotypes when I just simply use that language. That's flawed language that I was just using, but those are the types of assumptions that the culture of poverty concept promotes. And it gets very, very damaging because of the stereotypes and the assumptions. Because what you have out there is now you've got teachers, for instance, being taken in cars or taken in buses to tour neighborhoods that are high poverty and kind of gawk and say, see, here's what a high poverty neighborhood looks at, and teachers will kind of gawk and leer um, in these tours, and they might have certain testimonies given, but it's not from the standpoint of getting to know knowledge and strengths and asset and true back and forth real communication and real empathy. It's more of a pity type of approach. And that's an objectification type of approach. That gets to be very problematic, and that's been reified, repeated over and over and over again in this nation. And it's something we really need to get away from. One example of the culture of poverty approach getting repeatedly promoted in school districts is the work of Ruby Payne. And now I'm doing this knowing that this is controversial, what I'm saying, and it could actually get some people objecting to what I'm saying, because I realize that the work of Ruby Payne is extremely popular. Um, Her book called A Framework for Understanding Poverty was first published in 1995, and it's been repeatedly made into multiple editions over the past more than 25 years. Millions of copies have been sold. And other professional development frameworks promoted by her publishing company, her self-publishing company, called AHA Processes, have been done. And the professional development framework that stems out of Ruby Payne's company called AHA Process, and Ruby Payne herself, has become very, very popular over the past more than 25 years in school districts around the nation. Um, and there's a very strong likelihood that when you are a teacher, if you're not already a teacher, because I know I've got grad students who will eventually watch this video too, there's a very strong likelihood that you're eventually going to go under the a process of professional development that is based upon AHA Process and based upon Ruby Payne. Now, I'm not promoting you to walk out and revolt or get into an argument with your administrator and lose a job. Obviously, use some common sense. But I do want you to think about the difference between asset-based and deficit-based instruction, and I want you to think about these warnings I'm giving you, and I want you to look up some of these articles that I'm citing here. Look up research for yourself. The reality is that, and Payne herself readily acknowledges this, she is writing based upon the work of Oscar Lewis, and her notion of a culture of poverty draws very explicitly from the work of Oscar Lewis. And her work has been found repeatedly by scholars to be filled with negative stereotypes about people who live in poverty, as well as a deficit-based perspective, as well as inaccurate scholarship. Uh, and so be wary, be careful. So hopefully this was worthwhile to you. And again, my bottom line in conclusion is I want you to look for ways to value your students as individuals. I want you to look for ways of, as you teach academic learning, whether it is vocabulary, academic vocabulary, or comprehension of texts, or math concepts, science concepts. Look for ways of getting to know the background knowledge of your students, the passion, the interests, as well as that might exist in their families and their communities. Operate under the assumption that even if there are structural inequities that the children are striving to overcome, avoid negative stereotypes and look for strengths-based approaches to instruction rather than deficit-based, please. Take care.